Ronald Ernest Paul is an American author, physician, and former politician. He served as the U.S. Representative for Texas' 14th and 22nd congressional districts. He represented the 22nd congressional district from 1976 to 1977 and from 1979 to 1985, and then represented the 14th congressional district, which included Galveston, from 1997 to 2013. On 3 occasions, he sought the presidency of the United States, as the Libertarian Party nominee in 1988 and as a candidate in the Republican primaries of 2008 and 2012. Paul is a critic of the federal government's fiscal policies, especially the existence of the Federal Reserve and the tax policy, as well as the military-industrial complex and the war on drugs. Paul has also been a vocal critic of mass surveillance policies such as the USA Patriot Act and the NSA surveillance programs. Paul was the first chairman of the conservative PAC Citizens for a Sound Economy and has been characterized as the intellectual godfather of the Tea Party movement. A native of the Pittsburgh suburb of Green Tree, Pennsylvania, Paul is a graduate of Gettysburg College and the Duke University School of Medicine, where he earned his medical degree. He served as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force from 1963 to 1968. He worked as an obstetrician-gynecologist from the 1960s to the 1980s. He became the first representative in history to serve concurrently with a son or daughter in the Senate when his son, Rand Paul, was elected to the U.S. Senate from Kentucky in 2010. Paul is a senior fellow of the Mises Institute, and has been an active writer, publishing on the topics of political and economic theory, as well as publicizing the ideas of economists of the Austrian schools such as Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises during his political campaigns. Paul has written many books on Austrian economics and classical liberal philosophy, beginning with The Case for Gold and including A Foreign Policy of Freedom, Pillars of Prosperity, The Revolution, A Manifesto, End the Fed and Liberty Define. On July 12, 2011, Paul announced that he would forego seeking another term in Congress in order to focus on his presidential bid. On May 14, 2012, Paul announced that he would not be competing in any other presidential primaries but that he would still compete for delegates in states where the primary elections have already been held. At the 2012 Republican National Convention, Paul received 190 delegate votes. In January 2013, Paul retired from Congress but still remains active on college campuses, giving speeches promoting his libertarian vision. Early life, education, a medical career. Ronald Ernest Paul was born on August 20, 1935, in Pittsburgh, the son of Howard Casper Paul, who ran a small dairy company, and Margaret Paul. His paternal grandfather emigrated from Germany, and his paternal grandmother, a devout Christian, was a first-generation German-American. As a junior at suburban Dormont High School, he was the 200-meter dash state champion. Paul went to Gettysburg College, where he was also a member of the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity. He graduated with a B.S. degree in biology in 1957. Paul earned a Doctor of Medicine degree from Duke University's School of Medicine in 1961, and completed his medical internship at the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit and his residency in obstetrics and gynecology at McGee Women's Hospital in Pittsburgh. Paul served as a flight surgeon in the United States Air Force from 1963 to 1965, and then in the United States Air National Guard from 1965 to 1968. Paul and his wife then relocated to Texas, where he began a private practice in obstetrics and gynecology. early congressional career. While a medical resident in the 1960s, Paul was influenced by Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, which caused him to read other publications by Ludwig von Mises and Ayn Rand. He came to know economists Hans Holz and Murray Rothbard well, and credits to them his interest in the study of economics. When President Richard Nixon closed the gold window by ending American participation in the Bretton Woods system, thus ending the U.S. dollar's loose association with gold on August 15, 1971, Paul decided to enter politics and became a Republican candidate for the United States Congress. Elections in 1974, incumbent Robert R. Casey defeated him for the 22nd District. President Gerald Ford later appointed Casey to direct the Federal Maritime Commission, and Paul won an April 1976 special election to the vacant office after a runoff. Paul lost the next regular election to Democrat Robert Gamage by fewer than 300 votes, but defeated Gamage in a 1978 rematch, and was re-elected in 1980 and 1982. Gamage underestimated Paul's popularity among local mothers. I had real difficulty down in Brazoria County, where he practiced, because it delivered half the babies in the county. There were only 2 obstetricians in the county, and the other one was his partner. Tenure. Paul served in Congress 3 different periods. First, from 1976 to 1977, after he won a special election, then from 1979 to 1985, and finally from 1997 to 2013. In his early years, Paul served on the House Banking Committee, where he blamed the Federal Reserve for inflation and spoke against the banking mismanagement that resulted in the savings and loan crisis. Paul argued for a return to the gold standard maintained by the U.S. from 1873 to 1933, and with Senator Jesse Helms convinced the Congress to study the issue. He spoke against the reinstatement of registration from the military draft in 1980, in opposition to President Jimmy Carter and the majority of his fellow Republican members of Congress. During his first term, Paul founded the Foundation for Rational Economics and Education, a non-profit think tank dedicated to promoting principles of limited government and free market economics. In 1984, Paul became the first chairman of the Citizens for a Sound Economy, a conservative political group founded by Charles and David Koch to fight for less government, lower taxes, and less regulation. CSE started a Tea Party protest against high taxes in 2002. In 2004, Citizens for a Sound Economy split into 2 new organizations, with Citizens for a Sound Economy being renamed as FreedomWorks, and Citizens for a Sound Economy Foundation becoming Americans for Prosperity. The 2 organizations would become key players in the Tea Party movement from 2009 onward. Paul proposed term limit legislation multiple times while himself serving 4 terms in the House of Representatives. In 1984, he decided to retire from the House in order to run for the U.S. Senate, complaining in his House farewell address that special interests have replaced the concern that the founders had for general welfare. It's difficult for one who loves true liberty and utterly detests the power of the state to come to Washington for a period of time and not leave a true cynic. Paul lost the Republican primary to Phil Gramm, who had switched parties the previous year from Democrat to Republican. Another candidate of the senatorial primary was Henry Grover, a conservative former state legislator who had lost the 1972 gubernatorial general election to the Democrat Dolph Briscoe, Jr. On Paul's departure from the House, his seat was assumed by former state representative Tom DeLay, who would later become House Majority Leader. Libertarian Party and ventures. Following the loss of the 1984 Senate race, Paul returned to his obstetrics practice and took part in a number of other business ventures. Along with his former congressional chief of staff, Lew Rockwell, Paul founded a for-profit enterprise, Ron Paul and Amp Associates, Inc. In 1984, with Paul serving as president, Rockwell as vice president, Paul's wife Carol as secretary, and daughter Lori Pyatt as treasurer. The company published a variety of political and investment-oriented newsletters, including Ron Paul Freedom Report and Ron Paul Survival Report, and by 1993 was generating revenues in excess of $900,000. Paul also co-owned a mail-order coin dealership, Ron Paul Coins, for 12 years with Bert Blumit, who continued to operate the dealership after Paul resumed office in 1996. Paul spoke multiple times at the American Numismatic Association's 1988 convention. He worked with his Foundation for Rational Economics and Education on such projects as establishing the National Endowment for Liberty, producing the At Issue public policy series that was broadcast on the Discovery Channel and CNBC, and continuing publication of newsletters. 1988 presidential campaign. Paul resigned from the Republican Party in 1987 and launched a bid for the presidency, running on the Libertarian Party ticket. His candidacy was seen as problematic because of the party's long support for freedom of choice on abortions. Native American activist Russell Means emphasized that he was pro-choice on the abortion issue. In a forum held prior to the nomination, Means dismissed the greater funds raised by Paul's campaign, commenting that Means was receiving 10 times more press than the former congressman and was therefore 100 times more effective. In the 1988 presidential election, Paul was on the ballot in 46 states, scoring third in the popular vote with 432,179 votes. Paul was kept off the ballot in Missouri due to what the St. Louis Post-Dispatch termed a technicality, and received votes there only when written in, just as he did in North Carolina. According to Paul, his presidential campaign was about more than obtaining office. He sought to promote his libertarian ideas, often to school and university groups regardless of voter eligibility. He said, "We're just as interested in the future generation as this election. These kids will vote eventually, and maybe, just maybe, they'll go home and talk to the parents." Paul considered campaigning for president during 1992, but instead chose to endorse Pat Buchanan that year, and served as an advisor to Buchanan's Republican presidential primary campaign against incumbent President George H.W. Bush. Later congressional career. Elections. 1996 campaign. During 1996, Paul was re-elected to Congress after a difficult campaign. The Republican National Committee endorsed incumbent Greg Laughlin in the primary. Paul won with assistance from baseball pitcher, constituent, and friend Nolan Ryan, tax activist and publisher Steve Forbes, and conservative commentator Pat Buchanan. Paul narrowly defeated Democratic Attorney Charles "Lefty" Morris in the fall election. Despite Morris's criticism over controversial statements in several newsletters that Paul published, 1998 to 2013. In 1998 and 2000, Paul defeated Lois Neary, a Democratic Bay City, Texas, rice farmer and former Matagorda County judge. In the 2008 Republican primary, he defeated Friendswood City Councilman Chris Pettin, with over 70% of the vote, and ran unopposed in the general election. In the 2010 Republican primary, Paul defeated 3 opponents with 80% of the vote. On July 12, 2011, Paul announced that he would not seek re-election to the House in order to pursue the 2012 presidential election. Tenure legislation of the $620 billion bills that Paul had sponsored through December 2011, over a period of more than 22 years in Congress. Only one had been signed into law, a lifetime success rate of less than 0.3%. The sole measure authored by Paul that was ultimately enacted allowed for a federal custom house to be sold to a local historic preservation society. By amending other legislation, he has helped prohibit funding for national identification numbers, funding for federal teacher certification, international criminal court jurisdiction over the U.S. military, American participation with any UN, global tax and surveillance of peaceful First Amendment activities by citizens. Affiliations: Paul was honorary chairman of and is a member of the Republican Liberty Caucus, a political action committee that describes its goal as electing liberty-minded, limited government individuals. He is an initiating member of the Congressional Rural Caucus, which deals with agricultural and rural issues, and the 140-member Congressional Wildlife Refuge Caucus. Committee assignments: Paul served on the following committee and subcommittees: Committee on Financial Services, Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy and Technology, Subcommittee on International Monetary Policy and Trade, Committee on Foreign Affairs, Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. With the election of the 112th Congress and the resulting GOP majority in the House, Paul became the chairman of the Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy and Technology starting in January 2011. Paul's congressional career ended on January 3, 2013 with the swearing-in of the 113th Congress. 2008 Presidential Campaign. 2008 Republican Primary Campaign. Paul formally declared his candidacy for the 2008 Republican nomination on March 12, 2007, on C-SPAN. Few major politicians endorsed him, and his campaign was largely ignored by traditional media. However, he attracted an intensely loyal grassroots following, in large part energized by iconoclastic white men interacting through internet social media. In May 2007, shortly after the first televised primary debates, the blog's search engine site Technorati.com listed Paul's name as the term most frequently searched for, and Paul's campaign claimed that Paul had more YouTube channel subscribers than Barack Obama or any other candidate for president. For a candidate who had had relatively low national name recognition prior to entering the race, Paul did surprisingly well in fundraising, taking in more money than any other Republican candidate in the fourth quarter of 2007, as the primary season headed into the Iowa caucuses. Despite benefiting from large numbers of campaign contributions from individual donors, and the efforts of tech-savvy supporters determined to keep his name a frequent topic of discussion on the internet, over the course of the campaign Paul was unable to translate the enthusiasm of his core supporters into large enough numbers of actual primary votes to unseat his rivals. Paul came in fifth place in both the January 4th Iowa caucuses and the January 8th New Hampshire primary, with the exception of the Nevada caucus's January 19th, where he came in second behind Romney. He did little better through the rest of January. Michigan 4th, South Carolina 5th, Florida 5th. On Super Tuesday, February 5th, he placed fourth in almost every state, generally taking in a mere 3 to 6% of the votes, although he did better in the northern states of North Dakota and Montana. By March, frontrunner John McCain had secured enough pledged delegates to guarantee that he would win the nomination, and Romney and Huckabee had both formally withdrawn from the race. Paul, who had won no state primaries, knew that it was now mathematically impossible for him to win the nomination, as he had captured only 20 to 40 pledged delegates compared to more than 1,191 for McCain. Yet he refused to concede the race. race and said that it was unlikely that he would ultimately endorse McCain. Over the next few weeks, Paul's supporters clashed with establishment Republicans at several county and state party conventions over state party rules, the party platforms, and selection of delegates for the national convention. In one of the more dramatic moments, Nevada state party leaders, outmaneuvered by Paul's supporters at the state nominating convention, resorted to the highly unusual measure of prematurely and abruptly shutting down the convention before selecting national delegates, with a plan to reconvene at a later date. On June 12, 2008, Paul finally withdrew his bid for the Republican nomination. He later said that one of the reasons he did not run in the general election as a third-party candidate after losing the primaries was that, as a concession to gain ballot access in certain states, he had signed legally binding agreements to not run a third-party campaign if he lost the primary. Some of the $4 million remaining campaign contributions was invested into the new political action and advocacy group called Ron Paul's Campaign for Liberty. Refusal to endorse the Republican nominee. At his September 10, 2008 press conference, Paul announced his general support of four third-party candidates: Cynthia McKinney, Bob Barr, Chuck Baldwin, and Ralph Nader. He said that each of them had pledged to adhere to a policy of balancing budgets, bringing the troops home, defending privacy and personal liberties, and investigating the Federal Reserve. Paul also said that under no circumstances would he be endorsing either of the two main parties' candidates because there were no real differences between them, and because neither of them, if elected, would seek to make the fundamental changes in governance that were necessary. He urged instead that, rather than contribute to the charade that the two-party election system had become, the voters support the third-party candidates as a protest vote to force change in the election process. Later that same day, Paul gave a televised interview with Nader saying much the same again. 2 weeks later, shocked and disappointed that Bob Barr had pulled out of attending the press conference at the last minute and had admonished Paul for remaining neutral and failing to say which specific candidate Paul would vote for in the general election, Paul released a statement saying that he had decided to endorse Chuck Baldwin, the Constitution Party candidate for president. Paul withdrew from active campaigning in the last weeks of the primary election period. He received 42,426 votes, or 0.03% of the total cast, in the general election. 2012 presidential campaign. 2012 Republican primary campaign. Paul won several early straw polls for the 2012 Republican presidential nomination, and in late April 2011, he formed an official exploratory committee. He participated in the first Republican presidential debate on May 5, 2011 and on May 13, 2011. Paul formally announced his candidacy in an interview on ABC's Good Morning America. He placed second in the 2011 Ames straw poll, missing first by 0.9%. In December 2011, with Paul's increased support, the controversy over racist and homophobic statements in several Ron Paul newsletters in the 1980s and early 1990s once again gained media attention. During this time, Paul supporters asserted that he was continually ignored by the media despite his significant support, citing examples of where television news shows would fail to mention Paul in discussions of the Republican presidential hopefuls even when he was polling second. Ron Paul's presidential campaign paid former Iowa State Senator Kent Sorensen $73,000 to switch his support from Wahida, Michelle Bachmann to Paul. In court papers filed in August 2014, Sorensen said that he had been paid by both presidential campaigns for his endorsement and pleaded guilty to criminal charges stemming from the incident. Paul came in third in the Iowa Republican caucus held on January 3, 2012. Out of a turnout of 121,503 votes, Paul took 26,036 of the certified votes. Rick Santorum and Mitt Romney finished in a virtual tie for first place with 25% each. Although Ron Paul had ultimately won Iowa at the Republican National Convention, gathering 22 delegates to Mitt Romney's 5. In the New Hampshire primary held on January 10, 2012, Paul received 23% of the votes and came in second after Romney's 39%. Paul's results then declined despite the withdrawal of candidates Michelle Bachmann, John Huntsman and Rick Perry. He had fourth-place finishes in the next two primaries, on January 21 in South Carolina and on January 31 in Florida. On February 4, Paul finished third in Nevada with 18.8% of the vote. Three non-binding primaries were held on February 7. Paul took third place in Colorado and Missouri with 13% and 12% of the vote respectively. He fared better in Minnesota with 27%, finishing second to Rick Santorum. On May 14, Paul's campaign announced that due to lack of funds he would no longer actively campaign for votes in the 11 remaining primary states, including Texas and California, that he had not yet voted. He would, however, continue to seek to win delegates for the National Party convention in the states that had already voted. In June, a group of 132 supporters of Paul, demanding the freedom as delegates to the upcoming Republican Party National Convention to cast votes for Paul, filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court against the Republican National Committee and 55 state and territorial Republican Party organizations for allegedly coercing delegates to choose Mitt Romney as the party's presidential nominee. The suit alleged that there had been a systematic campaign of election fraud at state conventions, employing rigging of voting machines, ballot stuffing, and falsification of ballot totals. The suit further pointed to incidents at state conventions, including acts of violence and changes in procedural rules, allegedly intended to deny participation of Paul supporters in the party decision-making and to prevent votes from being cast for Paul. An attorney representing the complainants said that Paul campaign advisor Doug Weed had voiced support for the legal action. Paul himself told CNN that although the lawsuit was not a part of his campaign strategy and that he had not been advising his supporters to sue, he was not going to tell his supporters not to sue if they had a legitimate argument. If they're not following the rules, you have a right to stand up for the rules. I think for the most part these winning caucuses that we've been involved in, we have followed the rules, and the other side has at times not followed the rules. Republican National Convention. Paul declined to speak at the Republican National Convention as a matter of principle, saying that the convention planners had demanded that his remarks be vetted by the Romney campaign and that he make an unqualified endorsement of Romney. Paul had felt that it wouldn't be my speech, that would undo everything I've done in the last 30 years. I don't fully endorse him for president. Quote, Many of Paul's supporters and delegates walked out of the convention in protest over rules adopted by the convention that reduced the delegate count and that would make it harder for non-establishment candidates to win the party's nomination in future elections. Supporters and media commentators had noted that the delegations from states where Paul had had the most support were given the worst seats in the convention hall, while delegations from regions with no electoral votes, such as the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, and Puerto Rico, were given prime seats at the front. Refusal to endorse the Republican nominee, as in 2008. In 2012, Paul ultimately refused to endorse the ticket selected by the Republican Party. He said that there was no essential difference between Romney and his Democratic opponent, President Obama, on the most critical policies. "I've been in this business a long time, and believe me, there is essentially no difference from one administration to another, no matter what the platforms. The foreign policy stays the same. The monetary policy stays the same. There's no proposal for any real cuts, and both parties support it." Paul received 26,204 write-in votes, 0.02% of the total cast in the election.